drove over everyone and everything he met. Thus we went on and on, jolting and bumping over the rough, half-finished roads. At length we crossed the broad Chenab, and after 7 more miles of the agonizing bumping, we suddenly stopped in the mist at a lonely little post house on a broad plain. The coachman threw down my valise and bag. As I looked surprised, he explained that this was Gujarat. I got down and stood stupidly staring while the driver gave a terrific blast on his bugle and vanished into the darkness, leaving me half frozen, bewildered, and aching in every limb by the roadside. A sleepy policeman with a lantern came out and took my bags. This was Gujarat. It was 4 in the morning of the 7th of March, 1859. It had taken me 24 days from Calcutta, a distance by road of about 1,250 miles, or perhaps a little more. It was now necessary, as the first thing, to find a roof to shelter myself under. After going a short distance, we came suddenly on the Dak bungalow, the stranger's natural home in an Indian station. I saw a room within and a bed in it, on which I incontinently flung myself and fell asleep immediately. When I awoke, it was broad daylight, and I was lying just where I'd thrown myself a few hours before, greasy, aching all over, with a parched mouth and a swimming head. So I fell to shouting, "Koi hai," till a greasy Mussulman appeared with a cup of tea. This done, one greasier even than himself brought several earthen jars of cold water. I stripped, bathed, and scrubbed, and deluged myself with water till the aching left my limbs. I put on clean clothes and felt myself a new man.
Now at last, Beams met his superior officer. Beams had been appointed as assistant magistrate and collector, which is to say, general deputy to the man who ruled the region, served as judge, and collected its taxes. The titles tell of 2 major preoccupations of the British in India by this time. Government, meaning mostly fair taxation, and the law.
Presently, a thick curtain was lifted, and the Deputy Commissioner, Major Robert Roy Adams, came out. He shook hands cordially and said, "Where have you come from, and what powers have you got?" I did not understand what he meant by powers, so I simply said that I had just arrived from Calcutta, and that this was my first district. Adams, ignoring in true Punjab style the possibility of anyone being tired or wishing to do anything but work, said, "Now let us go to court." Whereupon a chaprasi brought a pistol in a belt, which he bade me put on. He advised me to wear it always except in my own house, and this caution was not unnecessary, for it was not unusual in those days for European officers to be fired at by Mussulman fanatics. Poor Adams himself met his death in that way a few years later.
Let me interrupt Beams to observe that he has let us in on a secret here. There is already dissidence, resistance in his district. But note the certainty and contempt with which he dismisses it, fanatics. He and his colleagues were engaged in good and virtuous work, and who could be opposed?
In the middle of a plain, dotted here and there with groups of suitors waiting for the courts to open, was his courthouse, a large, long, and not very hideous building. Adams led me first to his own court, a roughly furnished room full of native clerks who all rose and saluted, bowing almost to the ground as we entered. Here I was sworn in with the oaths which it was still the custom to administer in those days, and signed a certificate to the effect that I had that day in the forenoon assumed charge of my office. Then he said, in his sharp, jerky way, "This is your court, these are your clerks, now go to work." And before I could open my mouth, he had turned and abruptly left the room. This was throwing one into one's work with a vengeance. Here was I, as ignorant of the whole business as a child, with 100 questions to ask, and no one to ask them from. Of law and procedure, I, of course, knew nothing. However, no time was to be lost. The head man rose and said, "These are the cases on your honour's file for trial. What is your order?" The people were already staring at me rather wonderingly as I hesitated for a minute. I said, as by instinct, "Call up the first case." Though what I was to do with it, I knew as little as the man in the moon. He smiled, as who should say, "Guessed right first time." He mentioned some names to an amla who went out onto the veranda and bawled loudly for some minutes. Then entered a dirty, greasy shopkeeper, the plaintiff. He spoke Punjabi, of which I could understand not one word, but the Sarishtada translated it into Hindustani as he spoke, so I got on wonderfully well. I was furnished with a printed form and requested to fill in certain columns. By 4 o'clock, I had disposed of all my cases. I went to bed intensely tired, but very much interested in, and pleased with, my day's experience.
For some in this world, the light, and for some, the darkness. In colonial Spain, the saving of souls and the collecting of treasure were the preoccupations of different men. And so it was in India. Beams was always of the light, not religion, but government. He went on to serve in Bengal, and 14 years after his arrival, was in charge of Cuttack in Orissa and the large surrounding district.
The great charm of the work of civil officers in India is its variety. In the course of one day's work, one has a dozen or more different things to do, each presenting some new feature of interest. So that if one goes to bed very tired at night, it is not the depressing weariness of sameness or drudgery, but the healthy fatigue of keeping mind and body on the stretch with a multitude of ever-varying calls on one's attention. And the joy, than which I know no greater, of feeling that one is working and ruling and making oneself useful in God's world. We got up at 5 or thereabouts, drank a cup of tea while the horse was being brought, and I went for my ride.
The morning ride was the ritual of the Indian Civil Service, still sometimes practiced. As an ambassador there, I was once persuaded for some weeks to the custom. It was a terrible thing for the horse. In those days, it was more than exercise. It was also government. A look at the fields and paddies, the new irrigation canals, and an example of early rising vigilance to the police and the soldiers.
Governing men is grand work, the noblest of all occupations, though perhaps the most difficult. But as I acquired by degrees more experience and greater familiarity with those petty but indispensable matters of routine which hang about all work, I began to feel my strength and enjoy my duties more. Returning about 6:30, my wife and I had our regular chota haziri in the veranda. Our little girls, who had been for a ride on their ponies, played around us. Then I went round our beautiful garden and gave orders. About 7, the post came in, and we looked at our letters, discussed any matters requiring arrangement, and read the paper, The Englishman, the leading journal in Bengal in those days. At 10, bath and breakfast, and off to court in my brougham, a drive of 3 miles, during which I read official letters or thought over the day's business. Our instructions were to decide all cases by the light of common sense and our own sense of what was just and right. On reaching office about 11, the first thing was to take the Faujdari, or magistrate's work. The public crowded into my large courtroom and presented many petitions, each of which was read to me by a clerk and orders passed thereon. Now followed interviews with the head clerks of each department: magistrate's office, excise, stamps, treasury, customs, salt, road cess, municipal, education, registration, land revenue. Each man brought those papers on which orders were required, took his orders, and departed.